Webinar on creating buy-in for mental health policies, presented by Energy Safety Canada. Our speaker today is Sabrina Trobuck, a Fort St. John, BC-based clinical counselor with a master's degree in counseling psychology and a bachelor's degree in education. Welcome, Sabrina.
Hi, I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you for giving your time to listen to the workshop. What we're going to be talking about today is how do we create buy-in for staff so that they are able to follow and continue with the mental health policies that have already been implemented and put in place in your workplace. So first of all, just to give you a bit of a background, this model of therapy that I practice was created by a man named Tony Martins, who lives in Surrey, BC. He started developing this model in the late 70s, early 80s, and I found out about Tony while I was living up in Fort Nelson. I went to a workshop that he was at and met him there. At the end of the 3-day workshop, I kind of knew that's what I wanted to do, so I quit my job as a teacher and moved back to Fort St. John and started my own private practice, which is based on his model. So the basic kind of bottom line of his model is that everything we do for a reason, and what that reason often connects back to is a person's core belief. So our core belief about ourselves is what kind of drives everything that we do. So for a lot of people, their core belief is feeling not good enough, not important, not valued, or unloved. We do have the other side where core belief is feeling like you are good enough, important, valued, and loved. So what I'm doing in my model of therapy with my staff is we're working with clients who have core beliefs of feeling not good enough, not important, not valued, and helping them to kind of shift and change that core belief so they feel more like they are good enough, they are important, they are valued. This is much different than just looking at symptoms of behavior and trying to address specific symptoms. We're going back to the core of everything. Our model of therapy is more of a long-term approach where we're generally working with clients for anywhere from 1.5 years to 2, sometimes even 3 years. We're not just changing the kind of behavior. What I was doing in the school system was putting out a lot of fires. What I'm doing now as a model in my model of therapy is we're spending a much more time trying to figure out why the fire is started in the first place. So again, it comes back to that core belief of feeling not good enough, not important, not valued. So if someone's core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued, it often reflects in a variety of different ways. Some of them are, sometimes there's lack of confidence or not believing in yourself. It's going to have a higher state of anxiety, lack responsibility or ownership for your behaviors, and more self-doubt and feeling more unsure. So that core belief, not good enough, not important, not valued, really fuels a lot of how a person acts and behaves in their regular life. So if we have a person whose core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued, their ability to cope with trauma, with stressors, with bullying, with various situations is going to be significantly limited. We're not going to be able to deal with things as well as other people. You likely can think of staff that you have where some people can handle and deal with things better than others. That is a reflection of their core belief. The more that core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued, the less they're going to be able to cope with and handle any kind of stressor or any kind of trauma. So if we look at the actual definition of mental health is a state of psychological and emotional well-being. It's different from mental illness. Now, poor mental health over a period of time can definitely lead to mental and physical illnesses. So if we look at our provincial, so in BC, in order to claim mental disorder, it is a reaction to one or more traumatic events arising out of and in the course of employment. Or if it is predominantly caused by a significant work-related stressor or a cumulative series of significant work-related stressors arising out of or in the course of employment. So this is BC's policy. Different policies are in Alberta and Saskatchewan. likely similar, but the wording might look a little bit different. So the problem with this is it's really hard when we have someone who is struggling with anxiety, depression, or that core belief of not good enough, not important, not valued. It's more difficult for them to handle those traumatic events that are happening in the workplace. They can't cope with trauma, with anything kind of outside of their norm becomes much more of a significant issue. What happens is it also becomes really hard to separate what's happening at work from what's happening at home. And part of that is because we're kind of like a bucket. And as we go through life, we get all these things that slowly get dumped into our bucket, and work is just one of them. So this is an example of someone who's had a lot of trauma in their life where they've, lost people they love. They had trauma in their childhood. Their parents were, neglectful or abusive. Their family dynamics wasn't good. They've had issues with past relationships, their own children. They're struggling in past works and jobs. They have financial concerns. Their friendships are struggling. They've had other failures. They have health issues. And now we're just adding work on top of it. So it's really difficult to put all those other things aside and just deal with any trauma at work. Now, if you're dealing with someone who hasn't had a whole bunch of these things in their bucket, who did grow up feeling fairly safe and comfortable and stable, work falling in that bucket where there's not a lot of other things is much more manageable. So they're going to be better able to handle work stress or work trauma because they don't have as many other traumas in their buckets. So again, these are policies that are BC's written. I'm sure in other provinces in Alberta and Saskatchewan, you've got similar kind of policies. The ones we're focusing on today are the ones that are working on helping us kind of work with the client so we can create more of a buy-in. So it's not so much on the developing and the implementation of the policies, but more how do we get the staff to buy into it. So we're going to be focusing on not engaging in bullying and harassing, taking steps to prevent or minimize bullying and harassment, and training staff and supervisors to recognize the potential for bullying and harassment and to respond and follow the procedures for reporting. So how do we create more buy-in in these specific areas? The key thing is understanding. We need to have a good understanding of mental health, of what our staff is going through, so we can support them. The more they feel supported, the more they're going to buy in to what we have to say. So if we look at that core belief, not good enough, not important, not valued, two of our most significant mental health issues that we have in our society are anxiety and depression. Core belief plays a significant role in that. If my core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued, I'm going to have more self-doubt. I'm not going to believe in myself as much. Therefore, I'm going to have more anxiety. Anxiety and depression work in a cycle. So if I have more anxiety, where I'm more worried, I'm more stressed, I'm more overwhelmed by things, I need that depression to kind of check out, where I don't have to deal with those kind of things. So anxiety and depression work very, very much in a cycle where the one is helping try to compensate for the other. So if I have a lot of anxiety, I'm feeling stressed and overwhelmed, I go into a depression where I check out for a bit, I don't have to worry, I don't care about anything. It lets me kind of recuperate from the anxiety. But then the anxiety kicks back in again and the cycle begins, and it becomes a very significant cycle that can be very challenging to break. So what is anxiety? Anxiety is a sense of danger. So when we sense danger, we go into what's called fight, flight, freeze. So in this little cartoon, you see the lion coming, which is the danger, and we see one little caveman there who's going to fight, another one who's hiding behind a tree, and the third one who is running away. So when we sense danger, we go into fight, flight, freeze. We don't really want to get rid of anxiety. Part of what anxiety does is keeps us alive. We need to go into that fight, flight, freeze response when we are sensing danger. Where it becomes an issue isn't so much when there's real danger, it's more when we have a sense of danger, when we're worrying about things, where we're creating anxiety in our brain but there really isn't anything to worry about. So for example, if there is a fire in the workplace, that's real danger. People are going to respond in a real way, fight, flight, freeze, to kind of sort through and figure that out. But worrying about a fire in my workplace when there has never been a fire in the workplace is creating this sense of anxiety or this sense of danger where my body is still going into fight, flight, freeze, but there really is no actual danger. So if we look at a person's core belief, feeling not good enough, not important, not valued, that creates a lack of confidence. I don't believe in myself as much that I can handle things because I feel like I'm not good enough, not important, not valued. If I don't believe I can handle things, I am going to have a higher sense of danger. I'm going to worry more about how I would handle things than if my core belief was I am good enough, I am important, I am valued. So anxiety definitely creates a much higher sense of danger in a lot of people whose core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued. So if we look at that sense of danger, so the anxiety that's created in our head, not real anxiety, for some people who have significant or severe anxiety, this can be happening hundreds to even thousands of times in a day. The other important thing to remember is one real traumatic event can still be responsible for thousands, possibly even millions of dangerous thoughts. So if I am, if I have a fire at work, I am going to go into fight, flight, freeze. But then every time I worry about that fire, I think about that fire, I wonder if another fire is going to happen, even though it's not, I am still going into that fight, flight, freeze response. I'm still going to have that anxious response that's happening. So even though the traumatic event is over with, every time we think about or worry about it, we create that again. The other significant concern with this is if a person grows up in an environment where there is a lot of trauma, where there's neglect, where there's abuse, where there's violence, where there's yelling in the home, what happens is the brain starts to constantly be looking and searching for danger even when it's not there. And it starts to create those kind of what-if scenarios where we're now creating danger even where there isn't danger. So if your staff or you have any kind of trauma in your past, in your history, especially as children, the chances that your brain is looking more for danger is really high. The chances you're going to have higher anxiety is also fairly high. So it's important to remember that it's not really about the event. It's about how we think about the event. So if we take the example of a fire in our workspace, there's going to be some people that are going to handle that fire way differently than other people. So if there's a fire and someone knows the policies and procedures for fire and they feel comfortable and confident with who they are, they're going to be able to go and deal with that situation, and it may not be an issue at all. For other people who have more self-doubt, who aren't aware of the policy, or who just believe they can't handle things as much, that traumatic event is going to be significantly more traumatic for them than for others. So we can't take a specific event and say this is a traumatic event for everyone, because it simply isn't true. Some people are going to be able to handle different events in a very different way than other people. And people's ability to cope with trauma and even decide what trauma is based on their own perception, how they see things. So what happens when we go into this fight, flight, freeze response? What happens is a hormone called adrenaline gets dumped into our body. Adrenaline gives us that boost of energy so that we can get ready to fight or to run away from a situation. So again, we don't want to get rid of this. This is part of what keeps us alive if we are really in danger. The problem is, if we're not really in danger, we're going through this, for some people, hundreds to thousands of times a day, where they're getting this constant adrenaline rush, but it really isn't necessary. There isn't really any danger. So what's happening is we're getting this boost of energy, but then it's not being used. So we see people who are always, they need to be constantly moving. They can't really sit still. They're always kind of fidgeting and moving things, or kind of the opposite, where they just kind of pass out on the couch and they can't really move at all because that adrenaline takes up so much time and energy. The other thing that's important to remember is when we get this adrenaline rush, this boost of energy, that energy has to come from somewhere. It can't just magically appear. So what happens is all of our non-vital organs get zapped so we can get ready to fight or to run away. So bladder, bowel, immune system, endocrine system, stomach, pancreas, kidneys, all those organs get zapped of energy so we can get ready to fight or to run away. If this happens when there's real danger once in a while, our body can react and respond to it fairly quickly. It's not too much of a concern. But if this is happening hundreds to thousands of times a day, it has a massive impact on our body. We look at irritable bowel syndrome, food allergies, all these illnesses, people getting sick and they can't kind of fight off a cold. A big part of that, if they have a lot of anxiety, is playing a significant role. If your stomach is being zapped 100 times a day, we shouldn't expect it to digest food properly. That's not realistic. So this anxiety has a massive impact on our body and our ability to cope and handle other things because our body is always being zapped of energy. So while that's happening in our body, we also have something that's happening in our brain. So what happens is there's a little tiny piece of the brain called the amygdala, which is where that fight, flight, freeze response is. But it's a very small part of the brain, and it can't really compete with the brain, the big brain, as it normally is. So what happens is a chemical called cortisol gets dumped into the brain. Cortisol is a toxin. It's a poison. What happens when we have cortisol in our brain is it shuts our brain off. Our ability to use logic and reason, to connect to emotions, sequence events, understand consequences, memory, they're all gone. When we have high levels of cortisol in our brain, we can't think straight. When I was working in the schools, I worked with learning assistant kids, but I also did some work with kids with behavior issues. If I had kids fighting at recess, the first thing they do when we come in is we take them and we separate them. They need time to let their cortisol levels go back down to normal. If I try to talk to them about what's happened in their current state, they can't do it. They can't function properly. Their brain is not working. You might be able to think of a time where you got into an argument or a disagreement with someone, a partner or someone, and you kind of you say something, and then a half an hour later you go, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have said that. That's cortisol speaking. Your brain is just doing whatever it can to try to get out of the situation. It's not using a logic and reason. It's not understanding emotion. It's not understanding there could be consequences. It's just reacting to try to get you out of the situation. So high level cortisol in your brain also plays a significant role. We also know that high levels of cortisol over a significant period of time, children who grow up in homes where there is yelling and fighting and violence and abuse and those kind of things, and they have high levels of cortisol in their brain, it affects their ability to think properly long term. We see it connected to things like learning disabilities, attention deficit, written output issues, math disabilities. It has a massive, massive impact. It changes the way your brain works. So when we have high levels of cortisol, we can't use these basic skills that we need to cope. General rule of thumb is it takes a minimum of 20 minutes for cortisol levels to go back down. Here in our counseling agency, we recommend to our families that we're working with that they take at least a 30-minute break where they just go in separate areas and they take at least 30 minutes to let that cortisol level go back down. Then they're much more able to have a more rational, logical conversation, more likely to take responsibility for their part in the confrontation or whatever it may be that happened. It can take up to 72 hours for cortisol level to go back down. If we have someone who's going through anxiety hundreds to thousands of times a day, their brain may never be completely out of cortisol. So we need to make sure we're taking breaks. It's a really, really important thing to do with high anxiety. So if we look at anxiety, generally, most people are aware of what their anxiety looks like when it's really high, when it's an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10. This is when we're kind of almost having like a panic attack or anxiety is very high. But most of us don't really know what our anxiety looks like as it is getting higher and higher and higher. What this means is, for the vast majority of us, we don't really even do anything about our anxiety until it's really high, until it's an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10. Well, by the time it's that high, I've got so much cortisol in my brain, my ability to use logic and reason is going to be significantly impacted. Also, even if I can use logic and reason and try to put some strategies in place, I got a long way to go to bring it back down to a really low number. Even if you Google online symptoms of anxiety, it generally will give you symptoms when that anxiety is really high, when it's an 8, 9, or 10. What we need to do is become more aware of what our anxiety looks like as it is slowly or quickly, depending on the scenario, increasing and becoming more and more and more intense. So we have some different symptoms that we can use that can help us identify anxiety in our body. We have physical, mental, and behavioral symptoms. Here's a list of some physical symptoms of anxiety. So it's things like a rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, shallow breathing or holding your breath, loss of breath, grasping for breath, clenched fist, clenched jaw, grinding your teeth, tight shoulders, back or neck, feeling really hot or really cold, and often it's even in parts like your hands get really hot or your hands and feet get really cold, getting a metallic taste in the back of your mouth, crying, fidgeting, fatigue, paranoia, itchy, dry skin, feeling lightheaded, feeling really hyper, an eye twitch, poor circulation, a lump in your throat, shaking or trembling, numbness, tingling, headache, feeling detached from yourself, stomach problems like irritable bowel syndrome, ulcers, indigestion, having a tight chest, sweating, feeling weak in the knees, knot in the stomach, or drop stomach, dry mouth, lump in your throat. These are all different physical symptoms of anxiety. What we need to look at is whether we think if we have these symptoms, are they connected to anxiety or not? So for example, if I get a rapid heartbeat, but it only happens when I'm running, it's likely not anxiety based. So if we stop and really think about these symptoms, we'll realize that some of them, are probably connected more to anxiety than others. Mental symptoms. So anxiety generally starts with our thoughts. That's how emotions happen. We have a thought, which then creates a physiological response in our body where we feel an emotion. So anxiety and our mental symptoms are really important. These are things like angry thoughts, negative thoughts, pessimistic or critical thoughts, worrying about potential threats, worrying about feeling trapped or cornered, worry thoughts, constant thoughts, catastrophizing. So this is taking something very small and making it way bigger than what it needs to be. Being judgmental, having a lot of self-doubt, obsessing about things, being easily distracted or disoriented, often saying, I don't know, shrugging or kind of going blank, shutting down, can't slow down your thoughts, having shameful thoughts, rigid beliefs that are very hard for anyone else to kind of try to challenge, questioning or self-doubt, indecisiveness, can't focus, fear, insecurity, paranoia, doing a lot of worst-case scenarios and what-ifs in your head, repetitive thoughts, worrying about things beyond your control, forgetfulness or memory loss, having very controlling thoughts, compulsive thoughts like counting or checking different things. If you have dreams of chasing, falling, or your teeth falling out, these all can also be significant mental symptoms of anxiety. Then we have behavior. So behavior, again, we want to look at those behaviors. Sometimes they're connected to anxiety, sometimes they may not be. We also need to look at, some of them can be helpful, like there's one on here like cleaning. So if I clean and organize and tidy my space and I feel more calm and relaxed, that's a healthy coping strategy. There's nothing wrong with that. But if I need everything to be super clean all the time and I become very stressed and overwhelmed if any little thing is out of place, then it may be more of an unhealthy coping strategy. So looking at symptoms of behavioral symptoms of anxiety, avoidance is the number one. The number one way people cope with anxiety is they just avoid it. They don't do it. But the number one way to increase anxiety is avoidance. If I'm working with a family who, say, is going on a trip and they're going to go bungee jumping and they have a fear of heights, and so I'm working with, you know, a dad who's 44 years old and a son who's 11 years old, it is going to be way easier for me to help the 11-year-old cope with his fear of heights than the 44-year-old dad. The main reason for that is the 44-year-old dad has been avoiding heights way longer than the 11-year-old son. So that avoidance where we put it off, we're not dealing with it. We're not challenging the anxiety. We're just trying to escape from it. That doesn't make anxiety better. It makes it worse in the long run. Anger, arguing, or rage, physically fighting or throwing things, feeling physically sick, stomach problems, stomach aches, just feeling ill, achy, being moody, having trouble sleeping or not being able to fall asleep, anger, yelling, isolating yourself or needing to constantly be with others, binge eating, drinking, or drugs, not eating, having a hard time focusing, difficulty completing a task from start to finish. You got a whole bunch of projects that are started, not a lot of them are finished. Depression, the inability to understand others, nail chewing, lack of interest in sex or becoming overly sexualized, pacing, running away from things, controlling, manipulating, having rigid beliefs, smoking marijuana, smoking cigarettes, blaming, excusing, denying, justifying, gambling, purging, cleaning, organizing, planning, list making, checking things, counting things, seeking attention or needing to be the center of attention, drinking coffee, leg shaking or bouncing up and down all the time, foot tapping, getting things done quickly or talking really quickly, not talking much at all, stuttering, using large words or higher educational words or catchphrases, avoiding eye contact, playing with hair, chewing, micromanaging, picking at skin, pulling hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, cutting, self-harming behaviors, gossiping, humor, sarcasm, putting others down, chewing on things like toothpicks or always having to have gum or candy in your mouth, biting your lip. These are all different symptoms. So we need to be aware of all of them. And some of those, again, some of those are not going to be for you or for your staff, but some of them are. What we generally do is we take a look at all of those symptoms of anxiety, and then we have people go through and check which ones are them, which one do they think are connected to their anxiety. So this example here is a studio client who has some anxiety, and we've looked at and we're gauging what it looks like as the anxiety goes up. So generally, all the time, they're always kind of fidgety and moving. They have a lot of worry thoughts. They're biting their lip or their cheek. They're chewing their nails, and they have a lot of what-if thoughts. If their anxiety goes a little bit higher, now they're sighing all the time. Sighing is a sign that you're holding your breath. If you hold your breath a lot, you need to sigh to try to get that oxygen back in. So sighing, a tight shoulders, neck and chest, racing thoughts, and a clenched jaw. So the anxiety goes a little bit higher. Now they're holding their breath. They're easily overwhelmed. They have lots of negative thoughts, lack of patience, clenched fists, and an urge to drink alcohol. And if their anxiety gets really high, where it's an 8, 9, 10 out of 10, now they're having a panic attack, they're having intense anger, tears, can't control their thoughts, yelling, and they're wanting to isolate themselves. So we can see this person's anxiety as it's escalating. If we wait until it's in the dark red area, we are going to have much more work to bring that anxiety down. But if we can put strategies in place between the green and the yellow, or between the yellow and the red, or even between the light red and the dark red, we can bring those strategies, put those strategies in place where that anxiety starts to go down. The more we're able to become aware of what our anxiety looks like as it's going up, we don't have to wait until it's really high. The problem with this is everyone's anxiety can look a little bit different. We need to make sure we're aware of what ours looks like and for other people to know as well. So each person's symptoms look different. So if we took everyone who's on here and everybody did a checklist and made a scale of what their anxiety looks like, there would be no one that would look exactly the same. Probably everybody would have a few of them that are on there, but where they would show up may look a little bit different. So it makes it really challenging to identify anxiety because it's very individual. Each person is different. It makes it hard for us to identify other people's anxiety because it likely looks different from our anxiety. And so it's harder for us to understand that. So what's important is we want supervisors, managers, kind of the bosses in work to be able to be aware of the different symptoms that it may look like in each staff member. If you are aware of more what it looks like for each of your staff, you're going to be better able to help and support them if they're feeling anxious at various stages. Rather than having a blanket statement of what anxiety looks like, it's very individual. So this is really helpful if supervisors and managers have this information, but it's even more information or more beneficial if supervisors and managers are helping their staff become aware of what their own anxiety looks like. So if they can learn to self-regulate and become aware of what their own emotions are or what their own symptoms are as their anxiety is increasing, and they put strategies in place, that's going to be much more beneficial for them as well, not just in workplace, but in life in general. So if we look at anger and anxiety, they're very significant. So anxiety, number one way of coping with it is avoidance. One of the other really significant ones is anger. Anger is one of the main ways we use to deal with anxiety. But anger is not a standalone emotion. There's generally other emotions underneath anger that we don't like to feel. So when those emotions come up, we switch it to anger. So if we look at anger, often what's under anger is anxiety, but also loneliness, vulnerability, powerless, feeling unheard or unloved, being abandoned, having fear or rejection, sadness, feeling like we don't belong, betrayal, insecurity, disrespect. If you think about a time in your life in the last month or two where you felt angry, stop and think about what's under that anger. The likelihood that you felt one of these emotions is really high. We generally don't like to feel these other emotions, so what we do is switch them to anger. We're more okay to feel angry. We've been programmed and conditioned through TV, through history, that anger is okay. So we're more okay to feel anger than we are to feel these other emotions. These other emotions are kind of scary. So when they come up, switch it to anger. I don't have to feel these emotions. But they don't go away. They just get pushed down. They're not leaving. They're just getting added to your bucket. Your bucket's getting fuller and fuller and fuller. So anger is a significant coping strategy because it works. If I have anxiety and I get angry, people back off and leave me alone, my anxiety goes down. So anger works in the moment. It makes it really difficult to get rid of anger because it works. But it also works when I'm not angry. So if I have a reputation, if people kind of know that I get angry, they don't bother me. They don't really challenge me. It's not worth the effort. So anger works when I'm angry, but it also works when I'm not angry. So it becomes a really significant strategy that becomes very hard for people to give up or not use because it works. It damages relationships and has other negative consequences, but it helps with bringing that anxiety down or not creating the anxiety because people just don't challenge you because they don't want to deal with the anger that comes with that. So anger has a bit of a cycle that happens. What happens is we start with the explosion. This is the big angry outburst. Then what we have is the honeymoon period. This is where everything's just kind of calm. The explosion is over. There's a sense of kind of settled. Maybe it's, yeah, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that, or, it's not going to happen again. There may be some of that kind of reconciliation, but it just is kind of that calm peace. But then what happens is daily stress builds and builds and builds and builds, and there's some sort of a trigger where we can release that emotion again and we get another explosion. The thing about this cycle is it's a cycle. It's very hard to break. We see this happening. For some people, this cycle may happen once every couple months. For other people, this cycle can be happening several times a day. So it can be as small or as big, again, depending on each person. This part here is what we call the eggshells. This is where stress is building and building. We know there's going to be some sort of a trigger. We just don't really know what it is. So everybody kind of walks on eggshells. When people try to remove themselves from this cycle and not be a part of it anymore, this walking on eggshells becomes a very significant part. Because no matter where you stop, you always end up kind of in that place where you're waiting for the next trigger. And if we have a family who has, a parent who's in this cycle of anger, and we have kids, and I talk to kids about, what's your general stress level being in this cycle? They usually give me numbers around a 6 or a 7. It's stressful, but it's all they've ever known, so it's not overly stressful because they know how to cope with it. But if a parent now says, okay, I'm not going to get angry anymore, and they step out of it, their stress level goes up significantly. If I work with a family and I talk to them about, okay, your parent hasn't been angry now in several days, where's your stress level? I often get numbers like 10 out of 10, 100, 1,000, because they're left waiting for that trigger. They don't know what it's going to be. They don't know when it's going to happen, but they've been conditioned that it's going to happen because it's happened so many times in their past. When this first starts happening, they shouldn't trust that it's not going to happen. So they're left stuck in this cycle where they're waiting and waiting and waiting. And often what they do is kind of poke the bear. They try to create the trigger so the explosion is over and they get a bit of that break, a bit of that reprieve before the cycle starts again. So this eggshells piece is a very, very stressful time for a lot of people who live in this cycle of anger. So if we look at the driving force and what is the piece that keeps this cycle going, it's this buildup of daily emotion. The emotion builds and builds and builds, and it needs to get a release. So this is the piece that keeps that cycle going. We need to have some sort of a trigger to be able to get rid of that emotion and be able to kind of distract from it or let the emotions out. So if we look at the trigger, it's not really about the trigger. The trigger is the excuse we use to be able to let out that emotion. The trigger can be anything, and it can vary from one day to the next. One day it may be, the staff room is not neat enough or not tidy enough, or the dishes haven't been done. The next day it could be the car not starting. It can be anything because it's not really about the trigger. And what we see often families doing is they're running around trying to make sure the trigger last time isn't there so it doesn't happen again, but there's something else because it's not really about the trigger. It's about that need to get that release, to get that explosion, to try to let some of that emotion out so we use whatever it needs to be. It can be things that we've handled and they haven't been a worry for days and days and days or weeks sometimes even, but then all of a sudden it becomes a trigger for that time because it's the excuse we can use to explode. Thing about a cycle is it doesn't stop. It just keeps going and going and going and going and going. It becomes very, very difficult to step out of the cycle. If we look at that cycle over a period of time, so here for each one of these hills that are kind of going up, this is an example of the cycle. So at the top of the hill is where often the kind of the explosion is or the release is. Things kind of go back down, then the emotions start to build and build and build again, and then we get another explosion and they go back down. What happens is over time, the space between these explosions becomes less and less and less. The other thing we see is the hills, the top of the hills, become higher and higher and higher and higher. So this anger at the beginning may be yelling. Then as it gets a little bit higher, it might be yelling for a longer period of time and kind of hitting things or punching a wall. Then it may be throwing things. Then it may be physical intimidation or even hitting someone. So that behavior keeps escalating and keeps escalating. The other piece that's important to remember is the bottom of these hills, the lower part, they also don't always have a continuous start at the bottom. They're going up higher as well, because every time we have this explosion, we have to deal with the fact that we've had a negative impact on people that we care about, whether it's workplace or home. Those relationships are getting damaged. So it never really goes right back down to the bottom because we always have to carry what we just did onto the next day. So we see this cycle becoming more and more intense and more significant as time goes on. Now, there is a solution to this. The biggest thing about the cycle is that emotion building. But if instead of the emotion constantly building, we allow ourselves to sort through and feel that emotion and let it out and release it, it doesn't have to become higher. So the explosion isn't really releasing the information, it's just kind of letting the top off and putting it back down. The emotion hasn't come out. But if we can find ways to sort through and let this emotion out on a regular basis, then our need for anger to push everything down to release this emotion isn't there, because we're letting the emotion out more significantly on an ongoing basis. So, what are some strategies that we can use in dealing with anxiety and coping with anxiety? There are some definite strategies that we can use. The first one is take a break. So we talked about high levels of cortisol in the brain. If there's high levels of cortisol in the brain, we need to take a break. We need to stop and we need to let that cortisol settle back down. So taking a break for a minimum of 20 minutes is a really significant strategy. Next strategies is we need to do the basics. We need to make sure we're drinking proper amount of water, we're getting good sleeps, we're exercising, and we're having healthy, nutritious meals. Our brain is kind of like Jell-O. If we took our brain and held it in our hands and blew on it, it would kind of ripple like Jell-O. It's 80% water. If our brain is dehydrated, we're going to have more anxiety because we're not going to feel like we can handle things because our body is not physically in the best shape. We're going to have more anxiety that way. Another really important strategy is breathing. So we've talked about cortisol in the brain. There's research that shows that breathing for 3 to 5 minutes actually stops cortisol from being dumped into our brain. So breathing is a really significant strategy. Now, for some people who've never really done a lot of breathing, 3 to 5 minutes sounds like a really long time. So don't worry about starting at 3 to 5 minutes. Start smaller. Start with 3 breaths or 4 breaths. Start by just taking smaller breaths and then slowly build. One of the things about people who have a lot of anxiety is they often kind of swing in a pendulum. They go from all to nothing. So I'm going to start breathing. Now I'm going to breathe every day for half an hour. It's unrealistic. It's too much. It becomes too overwhelming, and we go back to not breathing at all. So we need to take little steps and slowly increment that so we become better and better and better at being able to breathe and handle situations. The other strategy that's really important is it's important to remember that our thoughts create our emotions. What we think creates what we feel. What happens is we have a thought, it creates a chemical reaction in our brain, in our body, which then makes us feel emotions. If we can control that thought and manage our thoughts, we are going to manage our emotions. So we don't really need to control our emotions. We need to control our thoughts, which will then result in us managing our emotions. A good one, if you look at all the stuff going on with the COVID-19 right now, a lot of people are saying safe at home versus stuck at home. So there's a very different feeling around saying I'm safe at home as opposed to saying I am stuck at home. Safe at home creates a sense of confidence, a sense of maybe even pride or feeling empowered in being able to do something. Stuck at home creates a sense of feeling out of control, feeling powerless, feeling defensive. Those emotions are significantly different, but it's the same thing. We're at home. So how we perceive things plays a significant role in anxiety. If I'm always worrying about things, I am going to worry. If I can stop those worry thoughts and control those worry thoughts, I am going to better be able to manage those emotions where I'm not feeling as worried. We don't need to worry about controlling the emotions. We need to control the thoughts that are creating the emotions. So if we combine these two, we can also see some really significant benefits of managing anxiety. If we breathe and control our thoughts. So if we're doing mindfulness activities, if we're breathe counting, one of the ones we use is you breathe into your nose, air feels cool. Breathe out through your mouth, the air feels warm. If I say in my head, in calm, cool, out warm, worry, what I'm doing is I'm managing my thoughts. I'm thinking, breathe in, calm, cool, breathe out, warm, worry. That's not going to create a lot of emotion. It's going to be pretty neutral, calm, relaxed. So I'm breathing and I'm controlling my thoughts. I'm using a strategy that is going to help me manage my anxiety. Our brain is an amazing thing, but it can only have one anxious thought at a time. One thought at a time. So if we can control that thought and it's not an anxious thought, we're not going to feel as much anxiety. If we look at yoga and mindfulness and all those things that we see all over our communities right now, a big part of that is because that's what they're doing. They're controlling your thoughts and they are allowing you to breathe. Those are major strategies that are going to bring down anxiety. Debriefing is also important. So if there is a traumatic event or something that happens at work, people need to be able to just blah. They need to get it out. They need to talk it through. That allows their brain to process the information. So they don't need you to problem solve. They don't need you to reassure them. They just need to get it out. After they get it out, then they can be things like making a plan or giving them reassurance or whatever it might be. But in the moment, they just need to process that information. They need their brain to be able to sort through it. They need to be able to just say what they need to say and get through that information as a way of processing it. Another one is creating a plan. So remember, anxiety is connected back to lack of confidence. If I don't believe in myself that I can handle a situation, I am going to have more anxiety. If I have a plan in place and I write down a plan on how I'm going to handle something, I'm going to feel much more confident in my ability to handle a situation. So creating a plan gives us a sense of confidence in how we're going to handle a situation. Therefore, it's going to reduce anxiety. If we write it down, our brain likes visuals. So if I write down a plan for handling anxiety, I'm going to feel much more confident in my ability to handle it, and seeing that visual makes it more real. I'm going to have more buy-in, so writing a plan down can be very helpful as well. Another one is looking at worst case scenarios. If we keep creating a plan for a situation, it's okay to even take that and look at a worst case scenario of that and figuring out a plan for that as well. We are resilient people. If we look at everything we've been through in our lives, we've got to where we are. We've got through it. Maybe not gracefully, but we've got through everything that we've got through. We don't give ourselves enough credit. So even if we look at worst case scenarios, we can see that even in the worst case scenario, we would handle it. Might not be fun, might create a ton of emotion, might be really hard and really overwhelming, but we'd handle it. Once our brain realizes we can handle that, then it's going to be able to believe that it can handle other scenarios as well. The other thing that's really, really important is we need to let our emotions out. We need to allow ourselves to feel our emotions, to get them out, to be able to sort through things and just let that emotion happen. Emotions are kind of like waves. They kind of ebb and flow. And so sometimes that emotion is really high and the wave is really big. We need to just ride the wave. Don't try to fight it. Don't try to challenge it. Don't try to push it down. The more we do that, the more that anxiety builds with all the other emotions that's underneath that as well. If we can let that emotion out, we feel more like we can handle other things because we're not busy coping with as much emotion as we already have. The more we hold on to emotions, the more likely they're going to create anxiety because they are eventually going to have to kind of explode. The other strategy that's really important is we need to be aware of our coping strategies. And if we see those coping strategies going up really high, there's likely a chance that we're feeling more anxious, and we need to be able to manage our anxiety, sort through and feel the emotion rather than going to some of those coping strategies. So if we look back at this cycle and the cycle of anger where we've got the explosion, the honeymoon, the buildup of emotion and the trigger, This is true for anger, but it's also true for all other kinds of strategies as well. Stealing, depression, suicide, cheating, lying, drugs and alcohol, social media, busyness, restricting calories or vomiting, overeating or binge eating, shopping, self-harm, any strategy, you can put it in there and it's going to fit. You know, there's times where, if we look at alcohol, there's times where I don't need to drink at all, and there's other times where I may really be looking forward to and really needing a drink. The reason why that's different is likely because the emotion is building and building and building. As the emotion gets higher, my need for more coping strategies becomes more significant. So if we allow ourselves to sort through and feel those emotions, those coping strategies can become less significant. So if you're noticing them becoming higher, chances are there's a buildup of emotion that's going on. So the sudden use or the increase of a coping strategy usually means that that emotion is building up. Now, if my core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued, I am generally going to be going towards more unhealthy or problematic coping strategies. Everything I do for a reason. My coping strategies need to reinforce my core beliefs. So if I go out and drink and in excess, I feel like garbage. I maybe said or did things that I regretted. I spent too much money, damaged relationships, broke my, promise to myself, those kind of things. So ultimately, it gives me a bit of a break, but it also reinforces that core belief of not good enough, not important, not valued. Now, if my core belief is I am good enough, important, and valued, I still need coping strategies. I still need things to help me get through things. I'm just going to be drawn to likely more healthy coping strategies, like going for a walk, doing some journaling, things like that. I may not need to journal for a week or 2 weeks or a month, but then I feel like I need to journal. That's likely because the emotion is becoming more high. Using that journaling helps me cope with that and sort through that so then I can continue on. So if we see an increased use in coping strategies, it often means that that anxiety is also becoming more significant. So we're going to take a little break here, and I'll answer any questions that are before we go on to any of the information. So I'm just looking for questions. So there's a question here kind of around the trigger. Yeah, the triggers can be big or small depending on the scenario and the person that's involved. Often the longer we go where we put off or we try not to get angry, try not to get angry, try not to get angry, often the bigger that explosion is. The next one says, I appreciate this information, but how is it developing policies for, so this isn't about developing policies, this is about the implementation of policies. So you're right, if you're looking for how to develop policies, this is not the workshop for you. This is on, we have these policies developed, what do I do to create buy-in so that my staff is buying into these policies? And so what we're talking about in creating that understanding as an employer, the more I understand about anxiety, about mental health, about coping strategies, the more I understand about that and help my staff understand, the more they're going to be willing to buy into those policies because the policies are around mental health. So it is going to be able to create more buy-in. If you go to work and your boss sees you and hears you and understands you and is aware of anxiety and manages things according to that, you're going to be more likely to buy into implementing policies around mental health. You maybe don't need to go to those places of claiming mental health because you feel supported and understood in the workplace. There may not be as much bullying because there's a better understanding of what's going on in the workplace. So my information here is not about developing policies. It is around how do we try to create buy-in so our staff is more willing to buy into these policies. There's a question here that says, how do you deal with angry workers? This is the next part. We're going to be talking about different types of personalities, and definitely one is the more aggressive personalities. So I will get to that in the next part of this workshop. If at the end of the workshop I still haven't really answered that question, please ask it again and I can see if I can give you more clarification. Hopefully that answers your questions. We can take a little 1-minute break or so. Just if anyone needs to grab a water or do anything like that. I've got 12:57 on my clock right now. We'll take like a 1 or 2 minute break if anyone needs to grab anything or just stretch their legs. And if anyone has any other questions, you can let me know about that as well. So there's another question about how do you deal with an employee who feels like they need to cry a couple times a month. Again, we're going to be talking about that personality type again in this next half of the session as well. So again, hopefully I answer those questions then. If not, ask that question again at the end and I'll see if I can address it in a better way that gives you more clarification for that. Okay, we will get started again. Hopefully everybody's back with us. So the first part of the workshop was really trying to create some understanding around anxiety. Anxiety is by far the #1 mental health issue in our society. There's no question about it. Everybody has anxiety, again, varying degrees. We need it to keep us alive. And our anxiety is very much connected to that core belief, feeling not good enough, not important, not valued. So the more we understand that, the more we show understanding of mental health, of anxiety with our staff, the more comfortable they're going to feel. If our staff feels not good enough, not important, not valued, but when they're in your work environment, they feel understood, that is going to play a huge role in their buy-in with your work. So the next part we're looking at is kind of taking that anxiety and looking at, okay, so what does it look like in different people? So what we're going to be talking about is different personalities. So we have a variety of different kinds of personalities that we can break into 4 groups: passive, aggressive, passive-aggressive, and assertive. So these personalities are definitely a reflection of a person's core beliefs. Generally, people who are passive, aggressive, or passive-aggressive, that core belief is usually more not good enough, not important, not valued. If a person is assertive, that core belief is more I am important, I do have value, and I do have worth. So that core belief or that sense of anxiety can be reflected in these very different ways. So the first one we're going to take a look at is passive. So generally, people who are passive have that core belief of feeling not good enough, not important, not valued. They don't believe they have a voice, so they don't have one. They don't really talk or speak up much. They don't like to have an opinion. They don't want to be a burden on anyone around them. They have a lack of confidence and often feel powerless. They've learned that if they blend in, if they take care of others, if they're people pleasers, if they're quiet, they get through the day. So being passive becomes a coping strategy to help them manage things. Passive people generally communicate indirectly. They don't usually state what they want because they don't want to hurt anyone else's feelings. They really, that's a big concern for them. They're very worried about what other people think. But they still want people to know what they're thinking, and so they often expect others to figure out what they're thinking by reading their minds. They'll often pout or use more passive-aggressive ways to get what they want. They'll often also be in that kind of poor me state or victimization. They often feel kind of like they're the victim. Often for passive, this is a result of a lot of childhood trauma where they felt unsafe or threatened. It can be through being bullied at school, but it also can be through feeling unsafe in their home environment. Passive people are often very concerned about what others think and see in them. Passive people don't believe in themselves, so they need to have other people tell them that they're great and wonderful and how good they're doing in order for them to feel any sense of that kind of accomplishment or feel good about themselves. They're often very self-sacrificing. They're willing to put everyone else's needs ahead of their own. They think everyone else is important, I'm next. Later on, after they sacrifice and sacrifice and sacrifice, they can end up kind of resenting that person because they're always sacrificing. They tend to feel more comfortable once they get complimented. So if I have a task at work where I need to do a spreadsheet, I'm not going to know if I did a good job on my spreadsheet or not until my boss says, oh, you did a really good job. Then I'll feel confident in, okay, yeah, I did a good job. If I did a good job, but my boss even says, actually, that's not what I wanted, or, you know, that's not what I need, I will really beat myself up about how horrible of a job I did. Even though I maybe did a good job, it just didn't quite meet what my boss's needs were. They often feel like a failure, and they're often looking for praise or that reassurance because they don't believe in themselves enough. And passive people generally also don't like to be challenged, and they don't like to challenge other people. Passive people take direction very well. They're often very indecisive. They don't know how to make a decision. They don't like to make a decision. They don't want to put themselves out there in case it's not right, in case someone else gets upset or doesn't agree with them. So they often just prefer not to say anything or are very indecisive and go back and forth on their opinion. They often feel helpless and they turn over their power to others. They often struggle with telling the truth because they don't want to hurt other people's feelings. So this can be through lying, but often it's through just not saying anything, which is what we call lying by omission. They'll often put themselves down and belittle themselves, talk negatively about themselves, even in their own head. They're often people pleasers and rescuers, and they'll often use guilt to try to gain some attention or sympathy from others, get people to feel sorry for them. Passive people keep opinions to themselves. They rarely challenge. They don't like to rock the boat. They often feel that they're taken advantage of. They still want control. So a lot of people think if you're passive, you don't want control. It's not true. You do want control. It just looks different. It's more through pouting or the silent treatment, catering to others. If I create these scenarios where everybody needs me, that gives me a sense of power. The next personality type is aggressive. So similar to passive, the core belief of aggressive person is still not good enough, not important, not valued. They don't believe they have a voice, so they need to force it. They are much more kind of jamming it down people's throats because they don't believe they really have a voice. They also lack confidence, and they often also feel powerless, so they need to try to be really strong and powerful or try to have that need for control to compensate for really feeling powerless. They've learned they're aggressive, people back off and leave them alone. They've learned, I need to take care of myself because if I don't, no one else will. Oops. Nope, that was great. Sorry about that. Aggressive people often give the impression that they don't care about others. It's not necessarily true. They often do, but they can't show it because that makes them feel vulnerable. Aggressive people do not like to feel vulnerable. They often give the impression that they don't care about what others think of them. This is also usually not true. They do care, they just don't want to show it because they don't want to feel vulnerable. They do feel emotions, vulnerability, fear, anxiety, but they don't like to feel those emotions, so they push them down and hide it as much as they can and often use aggression to do that. They worry about themselves over everyone else. So an aggressive person says, I'm more important, everybody else is second fiddle. Doesn't matter, my needs are number one, my needs are most important over anyone else's. They use this aggression as a way to kind of keep everybody at a bit of a distance. They don't want to let people in because they don't want to get hurt, because they don't like to feel emotions, so they need to keep people at a bit of a distance so that they don't have to feel vulnerable, fear, rejection, abandoned, those kind of things. Generally, most people don't really challenge aggressive people because it's not worth it. An aggressive person needs to win. Aggressive people are often loud. They may be physically intimidating. They may invade personal space. They may do things like swearing or being verbally abusive. They generally don't like themselves, but they give the impression that they don't really care about others. Aggressive people are often very demanding of others. They don't ask. So rather than asking for something, they demand it. They're concerned only about their own feelings. They do feel fear, vulnerability, anxiety, etc., but they need to try to hide that or eliminate it as much as possible. If these feelings do come up, they do push them down with anger, and they're often also seen as bulldozers. Aggressive people don't like to be challenged and use their anger as a way to not challenge people. They need to be feared by others. So they believe that if others fear them, they're not going to challenge them, they're not going to question them as much. So it's a way for them to protect themselves. They believe that others are not okay or not as important. They are the priority. They often do feel helpless, but they replace that helpless, that fear, that lack of empowerment with domination or aggression. They need to be in control and for others to know that they are in control, because that reduces the chances that anyone will challenge them or question them. Aggressive people need to always be right. They need to win. They don't usually back down, and they're often willing to go to places that other people won't go in order to win. They will attack or blame others in order to stay in control, and they don't have a lot of real friendship because it's very one-sided. People need to cater to the aggressive person. The aggressive person thinks they're more important than other people, so their relationships are very kind of one-sided. They often show little respect and consideration, empathy to others. The next one is passive-aggressive. So passive-aggressive is different. Passive puts others' needs, or puts their own needs above others, like aggressive people. So I'm more important than anyone else. But they do this in an indirect, non-confrontational way, often without really having a voice. So they don't want to go head-to-head, which is more like a passive person. So passive-aggressive person says, I'm more important than you are, but I'm going to go around the scene to try to create what I need. I'm not going to go directly to it. Passive-aggressive people also have that core belief of feeling not good enough, not important, not valued. They don't believe they have a voice, so they don't use their voice. They use other ways to get what they want. They lack confidence, and they often feel powerless, so they use manipulation as a way to try to get control. So if someone feels empowered, they don't need to have control. If someone feels powerless, they need to try to have a sense of control. So control is not necessarily a healthy thing. The more empowered you are, the less you need to have control over other things. Passive-aggressive people have learned, again, I need to take care of myself. If I don't, no one else will. So we look at passive-aggressive and passive-aggressive. They're all coming from childhoods where they felt not valued, unsafe, not good enough, and they've learned that these are the things they can use to help them get through their life. Passive has learned, if I'm quiet, if I blend into the woodwork, I get through the day. Aggressive has learned, if I take care of myself, if I'm loud, people back off and leave me alone, I get through the day. A passive-aggressive person has learned, I need to be quiet, I can't explode, it doesn't work in my home, but I need to take care of myself because no one else is. So they've learned to be passive-aggressive as a way of survival. Passive-aggressive people are very good at manipulating, lying, and getting others to cater to their needs. They often say one thing, but then do another. They can be considered two-faced. They're often good at reading others and body language. They often can be a little bit of a chameleon where they can kind of blend in and figure out what's going on very well. Passive-aggressive people, again, don't really like to be challenged, and if they are, they use kind of indirect ways of dealing with it. Passive-aggressive people often change to fit into the other environment, and they use guilt to get what they want. They'll often create scenarios where people will feel sorry for them or feel bad for them as a way to try to manipulate them to get what they want. Passive-aggressive people are generally not trustworthy because they get what they want by doing whatever they need to do behind closed doors. They don't want people to really see it. They're sneaky. They can present as sweet and innocent, but they're often manipulating you, and often you don't even realize you're being manipulated until later on. They use blame and try to get others to take responsibility for their own behavior. They try to put it off on other people. If you didn't, well, if you would have, rather than taking their own responsibility and ownership. Passive-aggressive people may also struggle with friendship because of that trust issue. People can't really trust them and don't really know if they can depend on them because they're more manipulative, and they're going to do what's best for them. They're often very calculated and good at what they're doing. Now we look at assertive. So assertive is very, very different from passive-aggressive and passive-aggressive. An assertive person's core belief is, I am good enough, I am important, and I do have value. They generally grew up in a home where they felt safe, where they had a voice, where they learned how to express themselves. Sadly, for a lot of families, this doesn't exist. So more often than not, what an assertive person is someone who was more passive-aggressive or passive-aggressive, and they've worked through and changed that core belief by sorting through and dealing with their own trauma so that they feel more and more like they are important and valued. So when I look at my counseling agency, bottom line, that's what we're doing. We're taking clients who are passive-aggressive and passive-aggressive, and we're helping them to become more assertive. But we're looking at it at a much deeper level. You can go and take a weekend course or whatever it may be in understanding how to be more assertive, how to use body language, how to use your voice, and those kind of things. But if your core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued, those assertive behaviors are not going to last for a long period of time because it's not balanced. If I believe I'm not important, not good enough, not valued, why would I expect people to treat me like I am important, good enough, and valued? So what we're doing in our model of therapy in our agency is we're helping people to become more and more and more assertive by changing that core belief so that they believe they are important, good enough, and valued. But again, that is a long-term approach. It takes a long time, to your entire life to develop your core belief to where it is today. That's not going to go away in 4 to 6 sessions. This is more of a long-term approach to change that core belief. So assertive people believe that they are okay and others are also okay. They feel empowered and they're okay to share that sense of empowerment. They don't need to have control because they feel empowered. They have a voice, they make their own choices, and they're also able to support others who are making choices and decisions as well and having opinions. They stand up for themselves in a respectful manner. So an aggressive person may stand up for themselves, but it's also at the expense of others. Assertive person stands up for themselves while still respecting others. They don't have to be right. They're okay to give an opinion and for people to challenge them or disagree. Assertive people are okay to laugh at themselves, but they won't allow others to put them down or to put other people down as well. They accept responsibility and intimacy. And by intimacy, I mean that kind of feeling connected with others. They are comfortable sorting through their own thoughts and emotions. They're comfortable to be challenged. And they're also comfortable being present with others and allowing others to sort through their own emotions. Assertive people are interested in others' thoughts and feelings. They don't have to have their way. It's okay for them to take other things into consideration. It's okay for their choices not to be chosen as well. They value relationships and they work at maintaining them. Excuse me. Assertive people make conscious decisions based on each scenario that's happening. Passive-aggressive and passive-aggressive people generally react and respond, react and respond, react and respond the same way over and over and over again. An assertive person will take each situation and kind of decide how they're going to react and respond in that situation. And that situation could happen again in a day or a week, and they could handle it in a different way because they're consciously thinking through it, not just reacting and responding. They're okay to give opinions, and they're okay for others to challenge those opinions as well. So if we look at that bullying role, generally speaking, aggressive people often play that role of the bully. Passive people are often people who are more the ones that are being bullied, or may also be considered the bystander, where they see it happening, but they just pretend they see nothing and they just kind of move along. They're not going to get into confrontation. They're not going to say anything. They just kind of pretend they didn't see anything. Passive-aggressive can look a little bit different. They can be the bully, but they're often not really caught. They're not going to do it indirectly. They're often the pot stirrers that kind of go and kind of say something and then watch, you know, their creation come to life. So if they are bullied, if they can be a bully. If they are bullied, they'll often kind of try to get others involved and make it into a bit more of a kind of a dramatic or creative event rather than just going and addressing it with the boss. They make it into a bigger deal often. They may also be the bystander in a bullying situation, but they'll often kind of gossip or they won't report it. And they just kind of try to stir things. They like chaos. Now, an assertive person is generally not a bully. And they're likely not being bullied. And if they are being bullied, they're going to handle it in a respectful manner. And that may be talking to the person. It may be talking to administration. It may be looking at the policies and procedures. It can vary depending on the situation and the person that is being the bully. If they witness bullying, they're also going to do something about it. Again, that can vary depending on what it is. Maybe they're going and spending some time with the person who is bullying. Maybe they're talking to the boss. It can look very different depending on the situation that's arising. Now, one of the things that does happen is sometimes assertive people are being accused of being a bully. So if we have an aggressive person who is being disrespectful in having a voice, that's not assertive, that's aggressive. But sometimes we see someone who is really, really assertive, who's standing up themselves, who's having a voice, it's in a respectful manner, but they can be perceived by passive-aggressive or passive-aggressive people as being a bully because they're being challenged. So challenging someone in a respectful way with a respectful voice is assertive. But some people can see that as being aggressive because they just don't like to be challenged. So when they challenge, they assume that is bullying, but it's not really bullying that's happening. It's an assertive challenge on different actions or behaviors. So if we look at personalities in the workplace, so generally we often see people who feel more assertive when they're in the workplace. Remember, assertive comes back to that confidence, feeling more confident. If I look at workplaces, most workplaces have policies and procedures, they have routine and structure, they have managers, supervisors, mentors, training, there's also education and experience. So there's all these things that are put in place that makes you feel more confident in being able to handle your work because you have all these structures in place that allow you to figure out what it should look like. So we often see people who are in a work environment and they've been there for a while feel more confident at work than they do at, say, at home or in the relationship or parenting because it is much more structured. Now, an exception to that would be if someone's got, a new job or starting something new, now they might not be as assertive because it's more unpredictable, it's more unknown. There's policies and procedures, but they don't really know what they are yet. There's routine and structure, but they don't really know where they are yet. They haven't figured out about their bosses and who they can go to and who maybe isn't necessarily a good person to go to. So if it's something new, a new job or a new position, we may feel less assertive in that situation, less confident, because that core belief is more self-doubt. I'm not going to believe in myself as much, that core belief not good enough is going to be more significant. So we often see people in the workplace feeling more confident because they have these extra structures in place. So again, just to kind of summarize those, if we look at passive aggressive and passive aggressive, we're looking at that core belief of feeling not good enough, not important, not valued. They believe they are not okay. Their self-image is impaired. It is a coping strategy. It's not really a personality. It's not a personality that you're aggressive. It's a coping strategy you use to help you get through life, to help you survive. For people who are passive aggressive and passive aggressive, they often feel guilt, anger, not appreciated, frustration, lack of respect, powerless, guilt, shame. They carry a lot of those emotions with them. So if we look at relationships and who kind of is drawn to who, passive people are generally drawn to aggressive people, and aggressive people are drawn to passive people. So a passive person says, I want to cater to you. I don't really want to have a voice. I'm not going to challenge you. An aggressive person says, perfect, that works for me, because I want to call the shots. I don't want to be challenged, and I need someone to take care of me. So they fit. They're meeting each other's needs. Passive-aggressive people are often drawn to other passive-aggressive people. I'm passive-aggressive, I manipulate, and I'm kind of sneaky. They're going to be okay with someone else who does the same thing because that's what they're used to. But we can also see someone who's maybe more passively passive-aggressive, and they're more quiet. They may be drawn to someone who's more aggressive. Or someone who's more aggressively passive-aggressive may be drawn to someone who is more passive. So it can switch. Again, remember that passive-aggressive person is more chameleon. They're more able to blend and kind of fit into different things. So they often can kind of go into some of those other relationships as well. Sometimes we see passive and passive. These are the relationships where, you know, people, they've been married for 50 years and they've never had a fight. Well, that's because they've never really challenged each other. They've never really questioned each other. They don't really have a lot of conversations where they're really challenging each other. Sometimes we see aggressive and aggressive. These are the homes where there's often a lot of volatility and there's, you know, more fighting and yelling, even police being called to the home, those kind of things. Sometimes, and then we look at assertive. Assertive people are drawn to more assertive people. So an assertive person says, I'm important and so are you. So passive people aren't really drawn to assertive people because it's too much pressure. A passive person doesn't want to have to make decisions, doesn't want to have to make choices, wants to put themselves behind everyone else, and an assertive person says, no, we're equal. So it doesn't really fit. Aggressive and assertive don't really fit as well because an aggressive wants to have the say, and it's kind of my way or the highway. An assertive person says, no, we need to make these decisions together, so they often don't fit. Passive-aggressive people and assertive also don't fit because an assertive person is going to call someone on being sneaky or manipulative, and passive-aggressive people don't like that. So if we look at relationships, we often see these kind of scenarios where we see these people together, but this can also happen in the workplace. If you look at, we often have, little groups that kind of hang out together. We often see some similarities in different kinds of groups that are hanging out together as well. Generally speaking, when we're looking at managers and supervisors, the ones that are more assertive are going to have more of a following. Their staff is going to buy into them more. If they're more aggressive or passive aggressive, they're going to struggle more with that buy-in from their staff. So what are some things we can do if we're working with these different personalities? So one of the things, if we're looking at all of them, so talk about all of them at first, and then I'll talk about specifically each one. So if you're working with people who are passive, aggressive, or passive aggressive, the key thing to remember is their core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued. If they come into your work, they come into your environment, and you treat them as though they are good enough, important, and valued, it will make a huge difference. Often for these people, this is the only place in their life where they feel important and valued. When I worked in the schools and I was working with kids with behavior problems, I was working with pretty extreme behavior, throwing desks, ripping doors off lockers. But when they came into my classroom, I always treated them like they were important, good enough, and valued. I always treated them with respect and dignity. And I could get those kids to do just about anything because they felt safe, they felt valued when they were with me. So creating that sense of really valuing, really seeing your staff is huge in creating that buy-in. The other thing that's really important is we want to have realistic expectations. What I mean by that is our expectations need to be based on past behaviors. We need to take that personality into consideration. So if I have a staff member who's very passive and doesn't really talk much, and I want them to start talking more in staff meetings, that's an unrealistic expectation. So we need to base expectations on past behavior. So what that means is, if I've seen it happening in the past, it's okay to expect it to happen. But if I haven't seen it happening in the past, expecting it, all it's going to do is create frustration for me. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't set goals and work towards those things happening, but realistically, to expect it to happen today or tomorrow, it's unrealistic. So if I have a passive staff member who I want to start talking more in staff meetings, but they never have, I shouldn't expect them to. All that's going to happen is I'm going to get frustrated, they're going to get upset, they're going to get frustrated, and it's not going to work. But if I have a conversation with that staff member and talk about, hey, I want you to start talking more in staff meetings, and we put some strategies in place where I start getting their opinion more one-on-one. When we have smaller meetings with 1 or 2, 3 people, I talk with them about, hey, I want you to talk a bit about this. So I'm helping them learn how to talk more around larger groups of people. Then maybe a month, 2 months, 3 months down the road, they're able to talk in a staff meeting. But to expect it right now is unrealistic. An example of that is when I first started this job, before this I was a school teacher. So I had all my days off when my kids had holidays. I had spring break off, I had Christmas off, I had summer holidays off. I didn't have to worry about that. When I started this, my kids were 11 and 12 and it was summer holidays. I expected them to clean my house as well as I clean my house. So I got home the first day, I opened the door, the house was a disaster. I got angry, it's like, you guys never clean up, let's go, and it turned into a big battle. The next day I come home, house is a mess again. I get upset again. Third day I'm like, I'm not doing this anymore. And I realized I was the one who had unrealistic expectations. I was expecting my kids to leave my house as clean as I leave it when I'm home. They're 11 and 12. That was unrealistic. So I got to the door. I say to myself, remember, your house is as clean as your 11 and 12-year-old kids would leave the house. I'd go in. There'd be still a bit of a mess. I would say, okay, let's take 10 minutes to get it cleaned up and organized. So they still have the follow-through. They still have the consequences. They still have to clean up. But I'm expecting that it's not going to be perfect. My expectations were unrealistic. So we take 10 or 15 minutes, clean up, and then we have the rest of the evening to enjoy. I never damaged relationships. There was no yelling. There was no fighting. There was no frustration. There was no disappointment. We need to have realistic expectations. If your staff hasn't done it, don't expect them to. Doesn't mean you don't set goals and work on creating that so it becomes more consistent. But if it hasn't happened in the past, don't expect it to happen tomorrow. You need to put things in place to work on making sure those things eventually happen. So again, that's where that regular check-ins, if I am adding an expectation, I want to make sure I'm checking in with them throughout so I know that when it comes to due date, it's done and it's done the way I'm expecting it to because I've followed through. Rather than saying I want this done in a week, never checking on it, in a week I could be really frustrated, whereas if I checked in in a day or two and they were going in the wrong direction, I could redirect them at that time. Don't expect that people understand things the way that we kind of perceive them. So expectations are really, really, really important. So another thing that's really important is we need to follow policies and procedures and refer to them often. Have your policies and procedures visible in your office. If you make it about the procedures and the policies, it's less personal. When I was working with these kids that were behavior issues, I had IEPs, they're called individual educational plans, for each of these kids. And on there it said, If their behavior becomes escalated, this is what I do, step 1, 2, and 3. I would go into that classroom where the child was having a behavior issue. I would have that IEP, and I would say, okay, according to this is step 1, what we need to do. I want to be here for you, but we all agreed to this. This is the policy, and I would go through it. Now it's about the policies. It's not personal. So the more you reflect and you use your policies and procedures, you make decisions based on your policies and procedures, the more beneficial it is. I had an administrator that I worked with who his policies and procedures were in his office. Whenever you came into his room, if you could show that it fit with policies and procedures, he would do what he could to try to make it happen for you. If it didn't fit with policies and procedures, he was very able to say, no, it doesn't fit with policies and procedures. It's not personal. We have policies and procedures for a reason. We use them. The more we use them, the more beneficial it is. It's not personal. It's about the policies and procedures. The other thing is consistent boundaries and expectations. So you need to figure out what are your boundaries, what are your expectations, and keep those consistent every time. As soon as that boundary starts to kind of wobble a little bit, there's going to be pushback. And there's always going to be people who are more aggressive or passive aggressive who are going to be willing to push boundaries and push boundaries and push boundaries. If they're consistent every single time, they stop pushing them as much because they know the result is going to be the same. So consistent boundaries are really important. We also need to make sure we're giving very clear direction and asking for clarification of what is expected of them. Don't assume that what you're saying is how it's properly interpreted. So we need to make sure we're asking for understanding, asking for clarification. So an example of this was my boys were young. They were maybe 6 and 7 years old. And I was at one of those house parties where you could get those laminates that you could stick on your walls or whatever. And I got a laminate for my truck that said, dull women drive immaculate trucks. So I came home, my one son was still up, and I said, oh, I got a bumper sticker for my truck, and it says, dull women have immaculate trucks. My son didn't laugh, he didn't think it was funny. I thought it was kind of cute. My kids, I was living up in Fort Nelson, we were driving to hockey every weekend. There was always yogurt tubes and yogurt and socks and stuff in my vehicle all the time. It was always a mess. So I thought, perfect bumper sticker. So the next morning we get up, we have breakfast, and I'm talking with my boys, and my older son says to my younger one, oh, Mom got a bumper sticker for her car last night. It says masculine women drive dirty trucks. So his interpretation of what I was saying was not there. We need to make sure we remember that for everyone. What we're saying, we need to ask for clarification to make sure that their perception of what we're saying is what we're trying to say. Clarification is really, really important. It's also important to ask them, is there anything I can do to support you? What can I do to help you? What do you need from me? Because the vast majority of people, no one ever asks them that. So if you're the boss who asks, what can I do for you? How can I help you? How can I support you? Your staff is going to buy into you significantly because chances are you're the only person in their life that ever asks them that. The more they buy into you, the more they're going to follow policies, the more they're going to report bullying, the more they're going to feel like they can handle any kind of a situation that happens in the workplace where they don't need to go to claiming mental health, making mental health claims and things like that, because they feel supported and valued in your work environment. Another thing with all the personalities is we want to encourage accountability. We don't want to get into the blame game. Generally, we avoid accountability or responsibility by things like blame, justify, excuse, avoid, deny. So the more we challenge and create accountability, the better it is. If we have super harsh consequences for accountability, you're not going to get accountability. Accountability needs to be, okay, you screwed up. What are you going to do to make it right? Move on. I'm not going to bring it up in a day or a week or a month from now. We're moving on from it. We want to create an environment where people feel safe being accountable for their behaviors. We want to, again, discourage them from shifting blame or avoiding responsibility. The best way to do this is to remain calm, have realistic expectations, and accountability actions. So there are policies and procedures in place to help keep people accountable. Although another one that's really important there is be a good role model. The more you're accountable, you're taking responsibility for the actions and behaviors, the more your staff is going to be willing to step up and do the same. If you don't, why would they? Another thing you want to do with all your staff is you want to give responsibilities that they can manage, so they have a sense of responsibility and a sense of purpose, but it's not too much, it's not too overwhelming. So we need to look at where each staff is, and we need to challenge them in ways kind of within that realm of what they can handle. We want to ask their opinion. We want to listen to them. We want to hear what they have to say. We want to encourage them to talk about their thoughts and their ideas and their strategies. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them and implement them all, but listen and hear your staff is huge. Most people don't feel heard, don't feel valued. If you can give them this, that can be very significant. You want to acknowledge their success and appreciate and value that, and also challenge them at a level that is slightly above where they're working at. So you don't want them to get bored and complacent. Challenge them a little bit more allows them to kind of keep motivated and keep moving forward into new areas. So if we look at passive people specifically, there are some strategies we can do with passive people. So often giving them options rather than expecting full decisions. So if I say, how do you want to handle that? That might be too much for a passive person who's quiet, doesn't really have much of a voice. So for them, I might say, okay, so we've got this scenario. Do you want to do A, B, C, D, or do you have any other ideas? Now it's narrowed it down where instead of having a huge bunch of decisions, they really only have to make a choice out of a few. So you're still challenging them a little bit, but it's within a realm that they're capable of handling. Passive people, you also got to give them time to process. Let them have time to kind of think about what you're saying. It's okay to say, come back and let me know what you think. We want to give them that time to process. You want to acknowledge their work if they're doing good work. You want to acknowledge that. If they're needing to do something different, it's okay to direct that, but again, make sure you're doing it in a way that's respectful for them as well. Better to talk with them alone or in small groups rather than in a great big staff meet or something along those lines. That might be way too overwhelming for them. They also have a hard time being indecisive, so you want to make sure your decisions, and they often overthink, so you want to make sure that your directions are very clear and they understand them, and often even writing them down can be helpful for that as well. You want to ask them how they feel, if they agree, if they disagree, if they have any suggestions. Keep it very basic so they can even kind of give yes or no answers. They're going to be more likely to do that. If it's more broad, they're likely going to just say, oh no, it's fine, and kind of go on with their day and pretend everything's fine. With aggressive people, we want to be respectful and engaging. Remember, most aggressive people don't really feel respected. Most people just avoid them, don't really want to have much to do with them. So if you treat them with respect and dignity, you're going to get them to kind of buy in with that as well. It's also important, again, to ask their opinions. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you want to ask their opinions. Don't engage in heated arguments. If someone comes in and they're really aggressive and they're yelling and they're screaming or whatever it might be, don't engage. That's exactly what they want you to do. They want you to get engaged as well, so now they can turn around and say, well, see, they're always getting angry. They don't have to take as much ownership and responsibility. Generally, if you let someone just vent and yell and scream or whatever it is, they power out fairly shortly, usually within a minute or two, especially if they're not getting any engagement back. Then you can have more of a conversation about accountability. If you're manager or supervisor, you need to make sure you're putting policies in place for that accountability piece as well, but don't engage. Again, you also want to give them time to process and sort through and understand things. You want to take time, they need to take time to process the information before making decisions as well. Again, you also want to stay on topic. Aggressive people will often distract and get angry or upset about something that happened yesterday or a week ago or 10 days ago or 6 months ago or whatever it might be. keep them on task. If someone says, well, yeah, but 6 months ago, or yeah, but last week, it's okay to say, that was last week. What we're talking about is right now and right here. If you want to discuss next week, we can make an appointment for you to schedule so that we can talk about that later on. But right now we're talking about this directly. So you want to make sure you're staying on topic and not letting them kind of distract you. If you're working with passive-aggressive people, document. This is really important. Passive-aggressive people, remember, are the more ones that are kind of sneaky. They don't really, they'll tell you whatever they need to tell you to get through whatever they need to do. Documenting is really, really important, and then also follow up with those expectations. So if you're documenting what the expectations are, email that so both people have a copy, so then if they come back and say, well, you never told me that, you can forward that email that says, yes, right here, it's stated very clearly. So documenting is really important. Again, you want to encourage conversations to stay on topic. Passive-aggressive people can be very good at kind of trying to defer the subject so it goes off into something else. Make sure you stay on task. If they have something that they want to talk about, it's okay to say, we can schedule that for another time and have a conversation about that later. Again, you want to be respectful, but you also want to be very clear and very direct. The more you talk and go on and on and on, the more they get tools to manipulate. Short and sweet, very clear, very direct. You want to do follow-ups and check-ins regularly. Don't let it go for too long, because often that's where that manipulation piece can come in. Ask them for clarification. Do they understand what was given? You want to have them tell you back that information so you know and you've got that verbal understanding. You want to make direct eye contact and also watch that eyes on work. So if you've got a work project that they're working on and it's due in 2 weeks, don't just take their word for it that it's coming along. Ask them, okay, bring in the work. Let's do a review of where you've got, what you need to do moving forward. So you're getting a direct view of what that work in progress is looking for as you kind of move on. Yes, it does create a bit more time, but it actually creates less time because at the end you don't have to spend an extra however long chasing them down, looking the information, giving them more time, all those kind of things. The more you put these things in place throughout, the better it is time management-wise in the long run. And again, the really, really important one with passive-aggressive, document, document, document. So important. Even if you have a verbal conversation or a phone call conversation, it's okay to follow it up with an email saying, according to our conversation, this is what this was discussed, this is what we've agreed to. So we need to do that as well. Working with assertive people, it's important to remember that they are likely going to ask questions. They're going to tell you what you're thinking. They're going to challenge you. They're going to do this in a respectful way, but they are going to question and ask for clarification. They're not easily manipulated, and they're hard to guilt instincts. They see that as it's coming from you. It's not really about them. You want to be direct and also have fair expectations with people that are more assertive as well. So if we go back to the beginning where we talked about policies and the focus of policies, we talked about not engaging in bullying and harassment, taking steps to prevent or minimize bullying and harassment, and training workers and supervisors to recognize the potential for bullying and harassment and how to respond to that and follow policies. So what we talked about is understanding, how important it is to really understand mental health, understand anxiety, understand each person's perception of how they see things. What's their core belief? Are they more passive-aggressive, or assertive? Nobody's 100% of those. We're all a bit of a combination, but often there's one that we kind of sit in more comfortably. We also need to understand the strategies we can use to help support our staff. Creating these things, having an environment that does this is going to create more buy-in into those policies. Understanding, if you understand them, they are going to feel more understood and more valued. If they understand themselves and others more, they're going to feel more empowered, more safe. They're going to be more likely to buy into the policies that you have at your workplace as well. Value your staff. Remember that for many staff, their core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued. If you treat all of your staff like they are good enough, they are important, and they do have value, they are going to buy into your work environment more, and that means more likely they're going to buy into the policies that your work has as well. So the staff is going to feel valued by doing a bunch of different things. Being consistent and fair in your policies, reinforcing those, following through and having accountability for following policies. Supervisors and managers engaging with staff, see your staff, being understood, seen, and heard by the supervisors and the managers. Everyone being treated fairly, which doesn't necessarily mean the same, but fairly. If you have a single mom who needs to do hours different, that's okay to see those needs are individual, choose an individual. Her needs may need to look a little bit different than others. So it's fair, everyone's being treated fairly, but that doesn't necessarily have to mean the same. The more you do these things, the more likely they're going to buy into policies as well. If staff feels like they are valued, they're going to be more likely to buy into policies, more likely to have a higher sense of loyalty to you as their employer, more likely to be team players, less likely to have bullying behaviors, especially if there is accountability. So often what happens is that bullying behavior becomes a bit less, or if there is someone who is a real significant bully, but they've got everyone on staff on the same page, they often move on to another job, they leave. If there is bullying, they're going to be more likely to report those bullying behaviors, more likely to cope with stressful situations, work stressful situations, more likely to enjoy their job, and also more likely to stay with the company for a longer period of time, means less staff turnover, which again is going to create more of that environment of feeling kind of connected, more buy-in on policy because you're not having to review the policy with everyone. Every time there's a new hire, people understand and get that. So that's kind of my presentation for today. This is my business is Troback Holistic Counseling. This is my contact information. If anyone has any questions or anything that they would like to learn more about, just feel free to contact me or email me. We do offer training in these areas specifically with staff, where we help staff become more aware of anxiety and strategies and help them put things in place in the work environment. So if anyone is interested in learning more in those areas, that would also be fine as well. So I'll just take a few minutes and see if there are any questions that we need to kind of review here. So I'm just going to go. Oh, my nose is going all over. So there's a comment here about realistic expectations. Yeah, it's so important. It creates so much frustration for us if we don't have realistic expectations. Policies and procedures, not personal. I had one administrator that I worked with in Alberta when I was teaching there, and he had his policies and procedures, and it was the best work environment I'd ever had. Everybody bought in. Everybody felt that he was fair. He didn't have any favorites. It was an amazing environment to work in, for sure. Being a role model, yes, very, very important. Lead by example. Yeah, listening to understand as a way to listening to reply, very important. The more your staff feels like you are listening to them, you're hearing what they really have to say, the better it's going to be, for sure. So I'm reading the comment about dynamic personalities in my group becoming clear, so does mine. One of the good things about understanding these personalities is you start to see everybody's kind of like a neon sign. And what happens is you don't take things as personally. When someone gets really angry and aggressive at you, you look at it and you go, oh, wow, they're being really aggressive, rather than taking it as personally. So it really helps you kind of step back and understand where other people are coming from. It's not about judgment. It's not about, oh, you're an aggressive person. It's about understanding where they're coming from. They're doing that for a reason. That's what they've done for a long time to help them cope. It's not personal. It's not about you. It's about them and their behaviors. Another comment, listening is difficult for a lot of people. Again, that core belief feeds that. If my core belief is not good enough, not important, not valued, I'm not going to trust in myself that I can handle really trying to listen and understand where someone else is coming from, because I struggle with my own confidence. The more we work on that, the better it is. Um, it's not easy with aggressive people to listen and be able to manage the conversation and get back on track. You're right, it's not easy, but it is possible. And again, the more consistently you do it, the less they kind of push that envelope. So it's okay to let them have a few minutes, or to even say, you need to go calm down, come back in 20 minutes or a half an hour, let that cortisol level go back down, and then try to have more of a conversation where it goes on fast. If every time they get off topic, you're saying, no, you're off topic, we're talking about this, every time you say that, after you've done it 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, you will see that behavior change. The more consistent, the less times you have to do it over and over and over again. But if you're consistent for 4 and then you let it go for 1 or 2 or 3 times, you got to stop back at 0 again. So it can have a really significant impact. It isn't easy. None of this is easy. If it was, we'd be doing it all over the place. So this is hard, but there is a process you can use to make it more manageable for you. Next question is, do people typically fall into one category? What can one person be all 3? Oh, and I just answered, yeah, you're exactly right. We're generally a bit of a combination of all. The other thing is we can have varying degrees as well. So we can have someone who's super aggressive and then have someone who's kind of aggressive. We can have someone who's super passive, someone who's kind of passive, someone who's learning to be assertive, but they're still a bit aggressive. So we can see those varying degrees in as much as well. Consistency is a big issue, and doing the right thing when no one is looking as well. What is the best approach to accountability? Unfortunately, with accountability, you can only be accountable for what you see. The more consistent, the more you use policies and procedures, and you're sticking to those policies and procedures, the more you're going to have accountability. Are there going to be people who are still going to be passive-aggressive or aggressive or passive and manipulate situations? Absolutely, of course. But the more they know that there's going to be that accountability, the more they're going to manage that behavior. Not necessarily in general, but with you they will. So if I have someone who they know I'm always going to make them accountable, they're not going to push my buttons. That doesn't mean they don't still push buttons. They're just doing it to other people. So the more accountability you have, the more the people around you are going to have. But that doesn't mean they have accountability with other staff, other areas of their life. That can look very different. You can't control that. The only thing you can control is you, nothing else. So the more you're accountable, the more other people are going to respond to that accountability. But it's not an easy approach for sure. How do you address bullying characteristics and behaviors from leaders or people out of our pay grade? These people can be hesitant to constructive feedback. Yep, you're exactly right. Bullies that are in more of those higher levels, in more of those leader roles, those are really hard environments to work in. You know, you've got to kind of figure out what your boundaries are, how much you're going to put your head down and do your work, and kind of stay out of all of the office politics as much as possible. Maybe looking for another job, and when you look for another job, look for a leader who seems to be more assertive. They're not into that aggressive kind of personality. It can be really, really, really challenging working with a leader who is bullying, which is aggressive, but also passive aggressive, which is often bullying in indirect ways, or where you don't really see it, or they have favorites, or they have people that, you know, challenged them 3 years ago and they still won't cut them a break. Passive people as well in leadership want to please everybody, and they just kind of say yes to whatever. It feels very unfair as well. So working with a leader who is more passive aggressive or passive aggressive is definitely more challenging. There's no question about that for sure. And then I'm just seeing some positive comments. Thank you. I'm glad you guys are appreciating it. Okay, and there's a question again about the leadership, so I just kind of answered that one again, hopefully. Does degrees of stress change your traits and their strengths? Absolutely. So it's kind of like that cycle, right? So I may be more assertive a lot of the time, but when my stress gets higher, my emotion is building, I may go more to being more aggressive. So this, if we look at that cycle of anger, this may be someone who is more assertive, but they still have that aggression, but it comes up less frequently, maybe once every week, once every month, or whatever it might be. So definitely, the more stressed, the more overwhelmed, the more things are building, the more likely we're going to go to those more unhealthy coping strategies, or that need for control in using anger or whatever it might be. That's all I have. Oh, and I got 3 minutes to spare. Look at that. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to email me at any time. Just let me know you're from this workshop, so it gives me a bit of a frame of reference. I hope you enjoyed it. I wish it was in person and I got to actually see you guys, but I wish you all the best. Take care. Thank you.
Yes, Anna, thank you from Energy Safety Canada. We know Sabrina is a wonderful, engaging person, and she would have loved to do this workshop face-to-face, but on a positive note, she was able to send this information out to people in the 3 Western provinces. So thank you, Sabrina. We will be sending out a very short evaluation form by email. We'd love your comments, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you. All right, thanks again, Sabrina.
Okay, we're good.
Yeah, I'm going to end it on my end.
Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.